What a suave chap. Uber Chad. Very Indo-European garments available at Teespring. And now...
Hello everybody, my name is Thomas Rousel. I'm a historian. I studied medieval history at UCL and I focused on the conversion of the Anglo-Saxons, the English people, and also I looked a lot at Icelandic literature to look at the Old Norse religion and see how I could learn, and that might inform my knowledge of what paganism was practiced by English people before the conversion. And since then I've also been studying all other kinds of paganism to try and build up a wider, more diverse knowledge of paganism in general, because I'm also a practicing pagan, as I assume all of you are as well. And before we begin, I'd just like to ask, who here practices Celtic paganism specifically? If you could raise your hand. Just two. And how many Germanic specifically? 3, is it? Okay, so the rest, I guess, something else. And more importantly, has anyone here ever worshipped at a stone circle? Okay, that's quite... not as many, less than half. And what about, has anyone ever worshipped at a Neolithic long barrow? Just under half, I'd say, as well. And how about an Iron Age or a Bronze Age barrow? Okay, about the same amount for all of them. It looks like the same hands are going up every time, actually. But that's interesting. I just wanted to get that as an idea, because this is the subject of my talk today. I want to talk about how we pagans now regard the landscape and the features in it from the different times in the history of this island, and also how pagans at different stages in history have done the same thing. I'll begin with a quote. "Landscape is less a quantifiable object than it is an idea, a cultural way of seeing, and as such it remains open to interpretation, design and transformation." That's from James Corner in the preface to Recovering Landscape. And this quote, I think, establishes the fluid way in which culture and landscape develop together in an interconnected history involving rites and that influence each. So, coming back to Old English specifically, the Old English Anglo-Saxon people, we can look at place names in England, which are overwhelmingly of Anglo-Saxon origin, and we can see how they show the consciousness of structures that predate the Anglo-Saxon invasions. We've got words like llaw, which means a prehistoric burial mound, a barrow, but they also use that to refer to their own barrows that they built. Burh, meaning a fortification, either one that they built or ones that the Celts had built beforehand. But the ones that the Romans built, they called that a ceaster or caester, from the Latin castro. And they use the word haerc to mean a pagan temple. And that now is often transformed into the word harrow, like Harrow on the Hill station in London. Then there's also whale, which means holy pagan place, or it can also mean an idol, like a pagan idol. So that's often contracted to we, or wi, in English place names now. And presumably some of these idols and holy places were holy prior to the Anglo-Saxon times anyway. But the barrows I like the most. I'd like to talk about them the most because they have so many different connotations and they change throughout the Anglo-Saxon period and beyond. And barrows were originally associated with dragons, also with gods, especially Woden, who's like Odin in Norse mythology, and the god from whom we take the day Wednesday. And also with elves and evil spirits, which were called in Old English shucks, which is kind of hard to explain exactly what they are, but I'll just translate it as goblin from now on. So some of the place names we've got, Drakenhlauen means dragon barrow, Drakahau, dragon barrow, dragon mound, whatever, Shucksburg from Shukkabeorg, meaning goblin barrow, Shucklau from Schukkenhlauer, goblin barrow also, Grimsho, and Grim is another name for Odin, so that's Grim's barrow, Odin's barrow, In Wiltshire we have Adam's Grave, obviously a Christian name, but the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle calls it Woden's Barrow. So they changed it, obviously bringing it into a new Christian context. So you can see this reappropriation of the landscape for new mythologies, even continuing after Christianization. Wenslow in Bedfordshire, that comes from Woden also, well, Woden's Mound. Wensbury, that's in Shropshire, Woden's Fort, Woden's Burh. But then there's also a confusing thing that sometimes we have Elflow or Elflow, meaning like an elf barrow, but those never refer to actual barrows. They refer to natural mounds, like a natural formation, which for some reason was seen as being the burial mounds of elves. And the word elf in Germanic culture doesn't refer to, I'm sure you know, doesn't mean pointy-eared little people. It rather refers to a whole range of supernatural entities which are lower than gods but higher than men. So let's start with the dragon. Dragon in Beowulf, it lives in a mound, and it's associated with death and with greed and evil, and it dwells in that barrow. And the first human in the poem that goes into the barrow is a lowly thrall who is described as sin-tormented. And between him and the dragon, you can see like a quite negative association with barrows. But I argue that is something that comes from a Christian perspective later on. And we see an Anglo-Saxon poem called The Wife's Lament. Very beautiful poem with a cryptic meaning, which many scholars have argued over. The narrator is a woman who laments the fact that she's been forced to dwell inside a barrow. Her husband has cast her out, and she lives inside a barrow under an oak tree. And one interesting interpretation is that the teller of the poem is herself a spirit, a ghost, or even perhaps the ghost of a criminal who has been exiled, and that's because actually in the later Christian era, barrows became used as sites of execution, so for criminals. So that's one way of reading that poem, and I'll go into that a bit more later. So barrows are often, particularly Anglo-Saxon ones, the Anglo-Saxon boundaries that break up our landscape, the barrows are often on there. They're used as markers for the landscape to distinguish one man's land and another. And this is actually something we see in Celtic and Norse cultures as well. In Sweden is similar. Often, it's a clear marker. This is someone's land, and if you can say that was your ancestor there, then it's hard for anyone else to claim this farmland surrounding it. In the late Anglo-Saxon times, that association with criminals carried on well into the medieval times. In 1261, the Oxford Ira states that a barrow had to be levelled and destroyed, that is, by the sheriff, because evil men kept hiding in it, and they used it as a base to commit robberies and murders. And obviously so many were doing this so frequently that this barrow had to be destroyed. Now that's an interesting thing for us to consider, why that might have happened. Perhaps it's the case that the barrow was such an unpleasant place for normal people to go that it was a suitable hiding place for criminals by 1261. And you could actually confidently, as a criminal, hide in a barrow with no fear of being accosted because people were so scared of that place. In the middle to late Anglo-Saxon period, I think this fear of prehistoric barrows starts to develop. But in the early Anglo-Saxon times, they were just used as burial places. And I don't just mean Anglo-Saxon burial mounds were used as burial places, but Anglo-Saxons were burying their loved ones in ancient prehistoric barrows, around or in the grounds of prehistoric barrows from the Bronze Age. So that's interesting. That's about appropriation of different cultures' holy sites, because now they own the land, but their pagan religion was similar enough to those that had gone before, or they considered it similar enough that they could use it in a new context, or rather a very similar context, being it's still a burial mound. So superstitions start to arise out of that within the pagan time, but not really negative ones as such, but then they develop into negative ones after Christianization. But interestingly, we don't see a similar superstition arise around stone circles. There's no fear of stone circles in Anglo-Saxon literature. There's no fear in Christian times. They weren't really scary in the same way. And I mean, there is some medieval literature, like from Geoffrey Monmouth and others, that they associate Stonehenge with Merlin. And Merlin, although we see him as quite a paganized character, he is ultimately part of Christian literature. So he's safely within the confines of what's been made okay within Christian perceptions of the past. Therefore, Stonehenge is not a threatening structure in the Christian mind. So what about other ruins? We'll talk about Roman ruins and henges a bit more in the Anglo-Saxon mind. The Exeter book contains a poem called The Ruin. I'll read a little bit from it, and it gives an interesting insight into ruins in Britain from their perspective. Ratlish is this Whaleston, Wirde je Brakon, Burgstede Burston, Brothneth Enta Jowerk, that is. Froffus and Jechroerne, Hreuge Torres, Hrum Jeet Berufen, Grim on Lima, Sjerde Sjur Beerde, Sjorene, Jedreirene, Aldo Onderreotene. That means, wondrous is this wallstead wasted by fate. Battlements broken. Giants' work, that's Enter Jowerk, is shattered. Roofs are in ruin. Towers destroyed. Broken the barred gate. Rime on lime. Walls gate. Torn up, destroyed, consumed by old age. It's quite poetic. It almost seems like something a Victorian romantic might write. And you can see our romantic notions of the past are not something recent, and of the evidence of them, but the idea that they were built by giants is there quite prominently. And I think similar things you can see in Celtic mythology, where they attribute ancient structures to the work of giants. And also another Anglo-Saxon poem, Maxims 1-3, describes the work of giants. I'll just do the modern English. A king must hold the kingdom, cities can be seen from afar. Those that are on earth, the skilled work of giants, the wondrous work of wall stones. So, and there's many other examples, but I didn't put them all in here. But you get the idea about enter, which is where Tolkien took the word ents from, by the way, meaning giants, and how these specifically the Roman ruins were associated with them. But the Anglo-Saxons didn't really use these Roman ruins so much. You'd think they would live among them or just repurpose them for their own uses, but for a long time, especially the pagan Anglo-Saxons, they weren't really interested in them. They saw them as kind of uncanny, a little bit weird. Maybe they've been built by giants or some odd people of old times, and they built sometimes, even when they lived like in London, when they had London Wick, which is just outside the city walls, they just maybe build their houses against the wall, but they didn't build with stone so much anyway, so it wasn't really part of their world, just a strange thing. And the Roman sites weren't even used for farming by Anglo-Saxons, so maybe they were afraid of them. But once Christianization happened, then it changed, because kings started to give these Roman sites to the church. And I think that's because there's good building materials. The early churches could you use the stone to rebuild the first churches. And secondly, there was probably a residual kind of dislike of Roman areas anyway. So if you're a king and you're in this land, you want to get rid of something and give a gift to the church and give the spooky place that no one really likes. So I'll come back to Barrows. Once we get into the Christian times, they have to be dealt with. There has to be a way of accepting the taboo of these ancient things that everyone had been buried their families in, and they've become central sites for meetings and religious rituals, but now they need to be seen as evil. And we got a good idea of how that was done in the hagiography of Saint Guthlac, an Anglo-Saxon saint, which is pretty much a plagiarism. It's just copying the story of Saint Anthony, who goes into the desert, but and he has to deal with devils attacking him in the desert. But instead, in this version, it's a barrow in England, and the devils are spirits of the barrow. I've got a nice translation from it. Now there was in this said island a mound built of clods of earth, which greedy comers to the waste had dug open, in the hope of finding treasure there. In the side of this there seemed to be a sort of cistern, and in this Guthlak, the man of blessed memory, began to dwell, after building a hut over it. They, the demons, were ferocious in appearance, terrible in shape, with great heads, long necks, thin faces, yellow complexions, filthy beards, shaggy ears, wild foreheads, fierce eyes, foul mouths, horses' teeth, throats vomiting flames, twisted jaws, thick lips, strident voices, singed hair, fat cheeks, pigeons' breasts, scabby thighs, knotty knees, crooked legs, swollen ankles, splay feet, spreading mouth, raucous cries. For they grew so terrible to hear with their mighty shriekings that they filled almost the whole intervening space between earth and heaven with their discordant bellowings. So he seemed quite a brave chap to spend his nights among these creatures, but that was a sign of his piety. So what were formerly Barrow Wights, presumably benevolent ancestral spirits, things worthy of great reverence, have now been reduced to monstrous, ugly creatures, and the landscape had been repurposed for the new Christian mythology. So this way of existing beliefs being incorporated into new landscape, into new ideas, and the landscape rehabilitated is not a new thing with Christianity. I think this is what has happened throughout humanity, with series of invasions of different peoples replacing others and appropriating the human landscape for their own purposes. I grew up near a barrow on the Downs called Scutcham Knob, locally, which was called in Anglo-Saxon Quickhelm's Slough, or Quickhelm's Plough, the Barrow of Quickhelm, which is an Anglo-Saxon name for it, because it was thought that was the burial place where King of Edwin of Northumbria killed Quickhelm of Wessex in 636. But archaeology has shown that it's actually an Iron Age round barrow, so probably Celtic. So they made that up. But that shows how they were repurposing it, bringing it into, making it what was foreign familiar. And probably it had, I'm sure, religious significance for pagan Anglo-Saxons too, as it had previously done for Celtic pagans. And not far away there's Wayland's Smithy, which you may be aware is named after the blacksmith of the gods in Anglo-Saxon mythology, Wayland, whose equivalent in Old Norse mythology is Völundr. And he is sort of an anti-hero, quite a violent character. He kills and rapes, but he himself suffers greatly at the hands of King Nithhad, who captures him and forces him to work as a slave, basically, and his violence and raping are actually his vengeance for this injustice. But he's, in Anglo-Saxon times, a good sword was said to be Wayland's sword. If something was really well made or something well crafted, then you'd associate it with Wayland. So when they came across this great Neolithic long barrow, they thought this looked a bit like a smith, so, the smith's forge, so this must be Wayland Smith. And that's what it's been known as ever since, and there's all kinds of local folklore that's survived right into modern times, showing this natural human tendency to absorb the landscape into your culture. For a little bit of a side, for a foreign country, Ireland has very similar tendencies. The New Grange is a Neolithic monument, and for those of you who aren't aware, in 2015, the genetic evidence has shown that all the Britain and Ireland there was basically an enormous population replacement in the late Neolithic. So what we archaeologists call the bell beaker culture, now we recognise that the bell beaker culture was not just pots, it was a people. And that people is what is the same as us now. All the Celtic people and the Anglo-Saxon people are all descended from the bell beaker culture of Holland, that sort of Rhine area. And they completely replaced, over 90% replaced, all the people who had built the stone circles of Orkney, New Grange, Wayland Smithy, Avebury, Stonehenge, all these things that we had formerly felt like were ours. Now we know that different people built them. And our people, or our ancestors, are the ones who replaced them, either through, we don't know whether they killed them or whether they were carrying a disease that killed them, or we don't know how they replaced them, but they replaced them. And that happened over just a couple of hundred years. So something very dramatic happened. And we can see all around Stonehenge, a lot of people go to worship at the henge itself, but all around you've got these barrows. And those are from the beaker culture. So they were obviously, as soon as they came in, and by the way, Stonehenge was only completed not long before the Bell Beaker people arrived. So it was a new structure at the time they got there, and probably one of the most spectacular in Europe, or in the world, for that matter. And they immediately appropriated it and used it for their own rituals and built their burial mounds around it. So I think that's interesting. And something similar happened in Ireland with Newgrange. But in Ireland, it's always been a part of Irish identity. It's built into the Celtic mythology. It's part of the roots of the people, even though it isn't really, but in another sense. So it's said, in fact, to be the dwelling of deities, that Newgrange, particularly the Dagda and his son Angus. And in Ireland, some barrows have this importance as well as in England, but with law codes of 6th century Ireland said that if you can ride over a barrow, you can establish hereditary right to a land, because it was believed that, or we can assume it was believed that, if you were to ride over a barrow and it wasn't your land, then something bad would happen, like some kind of spirit in the barrow would come out and proclaim you an imposter. And of course, the she in Irish mythology, which sometimes people think that means the people of the mounds, but actually that just means burial mounds, and it's the Is she, which are the people of the burial mounds, which are essentially like all mythological entities, like in Irish myth and folklore. And they were basically some kind of transformed version of what had formerly been the gods of pagan Ireland, which had been reappropriated into, or neutralised into a kind of folklore which was acceptable to Christians, who allowed that to continue. So monument reuse is sometimes argued by historians to just be like about land ownership. So like the only reason an Anglo-Saxon would claim this Iron Age barrow is to show that they own the land now. But that's got some truth to it, but there's more going on, I think. And I think you already got the flavour of my talk, that it's something to do with spirituality. Like there is a religious regard for these monuments, and it's not merely about claiming land. In Avebury, around the stone circles, that region, 80% of all Anglo-Saxon burials are associated with an ancient monument. And it's not random. The round and the long barrows are the preferred monuments, and standing stones and stone circles are pretty much ignored. You don't find them using that as an Anglo-Saxon burial place. So a prehistoric barrow could be used by Anglo-Saxons as a meeting place. In Scandinavia, they have a ting mound. The thing is like the meeting of the people, a bit like what we're doing now. But they do it on a mound, which sometimes would have a mound specifically built for the ting next to burial mounds. But other times, I think they just used a burial mound, depending on what the location is. So it seems that in England, they didn't build a ting mound, they just found prehistoric mounds to do that. It's a great assembly point. It's good for speeches because you're a bit higher up and you can sort of feel important standing up on something high. Maybe I should get up on here today. But so even the barrows in England sometimes were associated with gods. We've got Thunderlow in Essex, which comes from Thunderslough, that's the mound of Thunor. Wenslow, Bedfordshire, Wodenslow, I already mentioned. So people weren't always afraid of barrows like in the medieval sources. They wouldn't be naming gods after barrows if they thought of them as horrible haunted places, and they wouldn't be having their meetings in the place that they were afraid of. And it seems that these tribal meeting places and religious shrines were the same thing. So in the sense that there was a holy place, but it also had a kind of secular function for meeting, which shows something interesting about that culture. To understand this transition into the fear, I should go more into look at the archaeology of barrow reuse. So we can see Bronze Age barrows in the late 6th and early 7th century are still being used in England for pagan use. So basically, for example, the Slonkhill near Brighton, they've recently just done a great reconstruction of one of the Anglo-Saxon men from that burial. He had an abscess on his face, so they've recreated that in one of his eyes. It's on display at the Museum of Brighton at the moment. But that burial is there's a square enclosure built around a Bronze Age barrow, and within this square enclosure, that's where a great many Anglo-Saxon burials are. Some of them within the confines of the barrow itself, but some of them positioned around it. And a lot of pagan activity follows during that period at the site, and that's presumably because once you start burying your granddad, your grandma there, then you're going there for your rituals. And also this big mound from the days of yore that sort of adds the ambience to the religious feeling of the place. But the same site, by the 8th century, that's when we know from literature that the barrows start to be demonized. We can't see anything in the archaeological record to reflect that until around the 10th and 11th century, and then we find that it's a site of execution for criminals. So that process after conversion of repurposing it, first it must have become a taboo place, and then later it's like, well, this is the perfect place to get rid of unwanted and undesirables. And then you can realise then when you've got the combination of one, the evil murderer, local murderer was killed there last year, and also that it's associated with the wicked pagan ways of yore, then suddenly you get a very powerful fear develop around these places. In 10th century, Alfric, who was an abbot, he said, witches still go to crossroads and to the heathen burials with their delusive magic and call to the devil, and he comes to them in the likeness of the man who is buried there, as if he arise from death. I think we can quite easily assume that what he's referring to is a residual pagan custom among folk custom among women who go to the burial mounds and commune with the dead in the way that they had done prior to conversion, even as late as the 10th century, and that this was seen as the devil, communicating with the devil. So, despite these superstitions, the archaeology indicates people did not give up the practices of burial associated with the mound until the arrival of churchyards. This shows an unwillingness to give up the old ways, and as well as that residual witchcraft. I think for us, it's authentic to incorporate human landscape into ritual, even if it's not an ancestral site, or maybe you disagree. Now we know that Stonehenge wasn't built very well, still part of our ancestors, 9% maybe, but not really the same as us. Does that mean we should stop using it for pagan rites? Well, that mentality wouldn't occur to pagans, as we've seen. They didn't mind appropriating other sites. On the other hand, they didn't like stone circles for some reason, so maybe that's another argument. You could use that argument. But I'm not trying to argue whether we should or shouldn't. I think I understand within modern paganism people have quite varied practices, and it's not my place to say what is and isn't to be done, but I do think we should consider how we reuse these old sites. So modern pagans, we're more informed, we have access to information that hadn't previously been available, from genetic evidence, archaeology, we're able to date things, and knowledge informs action, so the rituals that we're doing should be informed by knowledge we have. And the narratives of history and landscape that we create will reflect our attitudes to the landscape and the rites that we perform in it. Ultimately, there's no wrong form of worship among the landscape. It's not about what site you use. It's what would be wrong is unrelated to the landscape. But I think it's pious, and it's pious to be knowledgeable of your ancestors. It's pious to perform rituals. And it's good to honour the people, our ancestors, who have honoured the landscape in their own ways, in varying ways, in the history of this island. So, finally, ancient structures inform our sense of the past in our ancestral spaces, and this helps us to contextualise time allowing us to understand the past and our relation to it through our relationship with the land. Thank you for listening.
Go for it.
Any questions?
I did have a question, but I just wondered if you were aware that in the original plotting of the church in Crediton, which you might have been to while you've been or nearby when you've been travelling around Devon, the original plot.
Where, sorry, can you say again?
Crediton.
Crediton, oh yeah, we did go there.
St Boniface's church.
Yeah.
One of the markers on this plot of land was called Grendel's Hole or something like that. So
Oh.
even at the time that the church was originally being conceived, there was pagan remnants in the in people's understanding.
I didn't know Grendel had been used in any place names. I thought that was a unique literary name. That's very interesting, especially since St Boniface comes from there. It's like an important Christian converter of pagans.
Rather a kid, I think.
Yeah. Hi.
You were saying earlier that they were used to mark boundaries or territories to some degree. Was that because the populations then were already settling the land, or were they not moving or more nomadic?
Well, I think the thing is, burial mounds, you can see that they're used in different countries as land dividers in different contexts. So in Sweden, it's often the case that they represent the boundaries of land. And that's not like, they haven't had that great upheaval like the Anglo-Saxon invasion, like in England. So it seems that maybe the Germanic people, having had that custom in Germany and Denmark previously, when they arrived in England, they just used Iron Age Celtic barrows and Bronze Age barrows as landmarkers. Also, I think it's also possible, since you claim that your ancestors were buried in here, that's once you've established through the sword that this is your ancestors' burial place, then it's a natural boundary, because boundaries are always negotiated. So often you want something that is less negotiable as a border, like a river or a barrow which can't be moved, or a large rock, something like that. So I think it's just a natural convenience to choose something permanent like that.
There's a lot of barrows along ancient trackways, like the Ridgeway, for example. Is there any reason to that, or is it just a matter of convenience?
They're all different types. Like on the Ridgeway, the ones I mentioned, Scotch and Knob, that's from the Iron Age, and then Wen and Smithy is from the Neolithic. So completely unrelated cultures, completely different things. I know that the Ridgeway was used as a trap, like since the Stone Age. They got like flint arrows and stuff and spearheads. So if it's a road, I mean, that might be it. You want people to see, but the point of a barrow is to be seen. You don't want to hide it. You want everyone to know this was a great man. Like in the Odyssey, when they have the Greeks had their barrows, they're putting it on a promontory near the sea, so the passing ships can see. They'll see the burning pyre, and then they'll see the barrow they put on top of the pyre, and everyone needs to know this great person lived there. So I think, probably. We don't really know nearly as much about the Neolithic long barrow cult, the people who made the Neolithic structures in Britain, as we do about the people who did the Iron Age stuff. But I assume practically it's going to be something similar, really.
Yeah, because I was always told as well that the old ridgeways were chosen as routes because it was safe. Because down in the valleys there was forests, and you had boar and bears and wolves and things still. Yeah,
I mean, I don't know about in the early medieval and ancient times, but in the Middle Ages, forests were still scary even when bear and wolves start to decline, because criminals use forests. So if you're going to meet a highwayman or a bandit, they live in the forest, and you're more likely to get. There's a system of outlawry in Germanic culture too. So if you're an outlaw and you're banned from the community, then you're going to live in the woods somewhere. So that's where all the bad people live. Nathan?
The killing of criminals at these sites is effectively, I guess, almost like a poisoning of the land.
Yeah.
So this is just kind of speculation, but what may now reside there? Do you think they will welcome us coming along doing rituals?
That's a good point. I mean, that's that's exactly what I was talking about. We have knowledge now of a whole, a different context of the ages and the different uses of the site. And then as pagans, should we have rituals to cleanse that site, to repurpose it for its original purpose, to banish the spirits of the criminals who inhabited it, and to re-honour the original decent folk who were buried there. That's a good question. Yeah, I should leave it open for us to answer.
Which leads on to a second bit. Could you suggest maybe a source, a book that maybe we could perform such rituals based on?
I mean, the actual performance of. I've never read any example of a performance of that kind. We have an Anglo-Saxon charm for cursed land called Asabot, which is from Christian times. I think it's 10th century, 9th century. But it's obviously of pagan provenance because you can see from the structure, it begins with an invocation of what may be a goddess, Editza 3 times, and then also it invokes the Christian god, but the way it's done and the pattern of the whole thing is about, purifying the land from a curse. And at the end it finally ends with prevention of the malicious magic of witches or wizards from undoing the spell that you're putting to protect land. So I would repurpose that spell probably, since that's a pretty close source for it. It's actually cursed land in the context of farming though. It's not like for a burial bin, but I mean it's the closest thing we got in that way for if you want. Or you can make your own ones. I'm gonna have to do everything on the basis of what you can find in old sources, because as long as it's structured in the right way for a prayer and invocates the appropriate deity, then I don't see that should be effective.
Sounds like a good underground movement doing that. Might start.
Yeah, I endorse that. Great idea. Hi.
What do we know of the appropriation of water features like rivers and springs and that by the Anglo-Saxons? Because they all have Celtic names still, don't they? The rivers.
Actually, hydronymy, the naming of waters, is interesting because, like, generally in the whole world, there's this weird tendency that when other peoples invade land and they rename it, they don't rename water places. So some of the river names in England, they can't even be etymologically linked to Celtic languages. So they may be, who knows how old the names are, we don't even know. Because people, for some reason, they just keep the same river names. I don't know why it is. I think it's because you can't build on a river, so you don't care so much. I don't know if you can appropriate a river because it's often, it's often a boundary. There's very, very different use of springs, like holy wells, in Britain, and I think you can say for sure that they were, we know for sure that there were Celtic sacred springs in before the Anglo-Saxon invasion, and that these were also sometimes Romanized, like in Devon there's the one I did a video about. Yeah, Coventry Spring, yeah, and there's Coventina well up in in Northumberland as well. So there was a Celtic goddess who was Romanized under the Roman Empire to become a kind of nymph, but she still always had her association with the wells. But obviously, so many holy springs in England are Anglo-Saxon. So I think it wasn't necessarily a case of merely the Anglo-Saxons were seeing a Celtic practice and then copying it, because we know that the same thing happened in Germany anyway, and also the Vikings in Scandinavia, they do the same thing. So springs are generally seen as holy. It's quite a normal thing. So I think in the case of that, it's quite natural that they would just, if the Celts were recognising it as holy, there's no reason why the Saxons wouldn't continue to recognise the same place as holy. And also, of course, we know like there are so many are called St Mary's Well or something afterwards, because the Christians continue to keep them as holy, and that's something is quite beneficial for us, because if they hadn't have done that, for a long time well worship was illegal, but not for that long, because they realised it was a losing battle, and then they just started to, instead of ban well worship, just rename the wells and try and Christianise it. But that means we've still got these wells.
The barrows you said were built around Stonehenge. Were they done in keeping with the geometry of Stonehenge, or is there any suggestion that they understood why Stonehenge was designed?
I don't know about that. I don't know. No, I mean, when I drive past it, every time I see, you see barrows dotted all around on the Salisbury Plain, and there's no one ever visiting them, but they're pretty important archaeological sites, and they're obviously positioned visibly from Stonehenge. Like, I think it was a good place to be buried. If you could get a burial mound within visual range of Stonehenge, and you must have been an important person, because it looked a lot better in the early Bronze Age, late Neolithic, than it does now. So but I don't know about the alignment. I don't think that barrows are, as far as I know, there's no actual like solar alignment aspect in barrows, because normally just they built one at a time. So they don't build like several, like when another one comes, it's from maybe 200 years later or something like that, and it's a relative, someone claiming to be a relative or something, they want the association with that other barrow, which is why there's proximity to it. But I don't think that they're often quite higgledy-piggledy, the way barrows are sort of built.